billing module, some of these examples of how the FCM was integrated into these modules and how they function. So I've got some examples for EP, because that's usually the biggest one. If you can handle EP, the other ones are actually pretty easy. And I'll just go through some scenarios here, and I got a couple examples. One is pretty common, is add back the tenant square foot to the denominator. It just comes up quite a bit. Right now, there's not really a way to do that in JD Edwards. You can set up a formula to do this, so the contributor tenants want to be able to add that back in, and it's going to recalculate their share factor, a denominator out of that as part of their calculation. So we can set up a formula. The standard EP information, I'll show you how it ties it to the FCM. It's two new fields on the screen in your EP information where you attach the formula to the EP class. So we mentioned before we had the FCM formulas we created. This is how I tie it to a particular EP class. If it's going to run through standard JD Edwards, I just leave this field blank. If I'm going to calculate a formula, it will still run all the other processes in EP, standard JD Edwards out of the box, but this has one function that is going to calculate an FCM formula, which in this scenario is going to calculate the new denominator value. It's going to add the tenant square footage back into the denominator and calculate the new square foot or the share factor. So it will run through all the other standard EP calculations out of the box, but it will do this one special one that we're going to have to do as well. And it updates all the totals inside of the EP as you go through. So this is how you would tie it together. Hit EP calculation revisions, runs the standard process, nothing unique about that. So when you go into the EP information, here is our calculation. We had our numerator, which was the tenant square footage. We started off at 175 and it added the 5,000 back into it, and it recalculated a new share factor. Any one of these fields inside of page 1 or page 2 of EP information, you can recalculate with the FCM. And you can use other fields out of here in formulas to calculate other fields. Or you can reference the application builder table with a spreadsheet in it, or you can actually reference other tenants in the calculation. And I got an example we'll talk about, but I'll kind of hit that point real quick. Pretty common is you have your anchor tenant or your waterfall type tenant, where you need to be able to run an anchor or a base group first to get their calculation made of their net share or their TER values. You want to calculate those first, and then you want to use those values in other tenant calculations. You know the difficulty of that now. This is a problem that has right now, is you've got to be able to run those base ones first, and they have to be correct, and then you run your next group over the top of those with those numbers. Usually requires a modification or a spreadsheet to generate the details, and then you enter that data in. We even had another client that runs the process and posts it in one test environment, then they copy the data over to another environment to run the other piece of it. The tenants have to get very creative to be able to get through this process. We actually, with the FCM, it's just one process. They submit the batch, it goes out and it runs all of the kind of the anchor tenants or base tenants first, does their calculations, and with the formula, we reference their EP information as part of our formula. It reads that in, uses it as part of their calculation, and calculates their particular shares based off of the other tenant. So we can solve that problem. We can demonstrate that and solve that with the tool. It's a demonstrated piece that we can go in and set up, and we can do the calculation without having to think about how the formula needs to work. It's already built in to the product as just a default setup, so just about every retail real estate customer needs it. So that's how you can use the tool to do these other calculations. This is the formula that basically does this. That's all the formula is. At 13 is basically the original denominator value. There's where we use that, where we reference a table and a field alias in the formula, which is where the tenant square footage was at. Or we're saying take the original denominator value, add the tenant square footage into that, and we're gonna recalculate it. Very simple formula to do, and no coding had to be done at all to do that. For example of taxes, this is one that's pretty common, where you have your tax partial amounts to use in either exposure or net share. Again, you got to stick it in lease logs. There's different ways that customers get around doing that. They modify. You can do it outside JD Edwards, whatever they got to do to be able to get their tax information and use it as part of their calculation. So with our process, we use the application builder. This is that application builder spreadsheet we created by building to keep track of our taxes based on our different parcel numbers. And there's our total at the end. So we have the different taxes we're keeping up with, and we have a grand total there at the end. That's the formula. So when I come in at some point in time throughout the year, enter my tax information, it totals it up for me, and then I can run the calculation with EP, and it pulls that value in and sticks it in my class exposure amount. And then it will use that as part of my calculation going on down through EP. So I can use it to pull these data in other places and calculate it without having to go out and, again, modify or rip JD Edwards all the heck to get the data in there. So then what I just talked about is process-dependent groups, or what we call iteration. You know, that's where you have these dependencies when they need to get the pro-rata contributor tenants. They depend upon each other's net share to calculate the exclusion. So this is just an example of one that we've done for a couple of clients. That's pretty standard process that they come across and do. The system will take care of that, and you can run the calculus. Pretty common. Other types is you want to subtract out a tenant's net share from exclusion amount. It's just a formula. So nothing is out of off limits with what you need to calculate, because it's just a formula. If we can define, here's the number, here's what it needs to do, subtract or add or multiply, divide, whatever, we can calculate it, and it flows right back into the system. We have one that I know that they need, that we're setting up the formula now for another client. It's accruals, where they want to take estimated billing amount and then compare it to the actual bill amount, and there's a credit or a debit or a credit, and they want to do the journal entry to do the offset. We can do all that with the formula and write it back out to the general ledger. All that within the module without modifying JD Edwards to do that with. We have calculations where it's looking at the CPI to do an increase for EP that's based on the CPI information. So you can use a standard escalation program to generate the CPI amount, and then we can use a formula to bring that in and do our bump up in our EP. The FCM calculate the CPI amount. We've done them both ways. One customer had escalations installed, they were using it, so we let them continue to use that. We used the formula to bring it in. Another customer that was not using escalation, but they needed to have some sort of CPI increase, so we used the FCM to calculate it. Another one is where we want to bring in a subset of tenants in a range, a square foot range, and use that value for our tenants' calculations, their TER values for calculation, or their share factor denominator. So we can use that and put in a range, and it goes out and grabs the tenant's range and brings in their totals of their square footage and uses that. Again, whatever kind of scenario you can come up with. And then one of the other ones we have is cap groups, where you have, say on a lease, you have 3 EP classes, and you want all of those to use the same cap amount. You can set up your EP class that has your cap information that is tied to an FCM formula that will go out and calculate a group cap amount, and it puts it right back on that particular EP class as part of their cap history, and then use standard JD Edwards processing to link that back to your other 3 EP classes, and it will use that value the FCM calculated as the cap for each one of those other EP classes. That you can set it up to do that kind of out of the box without having to do a modification to do that with. And that kind of gets to kind of the end of some scenarios of how we took the FCM, had that integrated into a big example is EP, but the same concept is available in recurring billing, sales overs, and escalation. You're setting up a formula, you use the data to calculate it, and it flows right back. We've got that nailed pretty good. It runs through that, and it goes through, it pulls those values in, and then keeps building. It'll actually, what you can do, you can put in a threshold, and we have a client that says, we're going to keep running that iteration process until we get $5 of our desired amount, where all these are calculated $5 difference. So it will continue to run in that loop, building off of each other until it gets to the right amount, and then it will stop automatically once it gets there. And it actually, all the formulas write to a log file by the lease, by the BCI number, by the EP class. So, and the log file holds all the formulas. So, and But we just with the client, it's all there. They can be pulled in on the invoice to show the history or the detail that made up that particular calculation. So it writes it out there. So they've got the backup for it. We even have one formula that recalculates the cap amount, and we actually let it recalculate the cap history based off our formula. So that went right back into the cap history table without all the history was there for their future calculation. And then the formulas for like denominator and other stuff that we changed, it goes right into that logs table where they can go pull from that for their backup. And again, there's a lot of stuff we come across different clients where we add stuff to it that just makes it better. So that comes in and says, hey, I like the way this pulls this in or calculates this, but I'd like to be able to do this, this, and this. We've added a lot of features to it as we've gotten into clients and find a little uniqueness. Or we've opened up pieces of the product to where it's easier to do with the formula that maybe it wasn't before because we found something a little bit unique at another client. So we do that at no charge to the client. We'll put it in there, and it just makes the products better. So it's a lot of different things you can do with the tool. I'm confident that anything that we come across to calculate, we can handle with no problem, and make it very easy for the customer for what they're going to have to run into in the future with modifying. I mean, we've worked with customers right now that's gone out and got bids on customizing JDOs to do half this stuff that they don't have to do, and it saves them a ton of money. That they don't have to go in and rip JDOs apart just to get some of these functions that they need to be able to do. We help them do that. And you don't have to modify JDOs. It's one business function that you have to work with. Super easy to deal with. We can do a turnaround in a matter of hours where most people would take a matter of days to get a turnaround to do a calculation or a unique process in the tools. We can turn around and we use it to calculate a calendar that has the number of the opening hours for a shop in a mall, and they wanted to bill them for every half hour they were open outside of the normal business hour. And then they charged them electricity, cleaning, and security. And we can't do this. So he sent it over to me, and he tells this story. He said, I sent it to him on a Sunday night, and he goes, it probably wasn't 3 or 4 hours later, and he had it back